A Short Biography and Works of the Poet William Blake. In the year 1757 William Blake was born in London. Soon his father, a hosier by profession, recognized Blake's artistic potentialities. When he was 10, his father sent him to study at a drawing school. And when he was 14, William joined the engraver James Basire as an apprentice. This is how he developed more of his innate skills. As a young man he became an engraver, illustrator, and drawing teacher. Interestingly, he met artists Henry Fuseli, John Flaxman, and Sir Joshua Reynolds. Blake wrote poetry then, and his first printed collection, an immature and rather derivative volume called Poetical Sketches, appeared in 1783. Songs of Innocence was published in 1789, followed by Songs of Experience in 1793 and a combined edition the next year bearing the title Songs of Innocence and Experience, showing the two contrary states of the human soul. Blake's political radicalism intensified during the years leading up to the French Revolution. Actually, he began a 7-book poem about the revolution, but it was either destroyed or never completed, and only the first book survived. He disapproved of Enlightenment rationalism, of institutionalized religion, and of the tradition of marriage in its conventional legal and social form, though he was married himself. His unorthodox religious thinking owes a debt to the Swedish philosopher Emanuel Swedenborg, 1688–1772, whose influence is particularly evident in Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. In the 1790s and after, he shifted his poetic voice from the lyric to the prophetic mode, and wrote a series of long prophetic books, including Milton and Jerusalem, linked together by an intricate mythology and symbolism of Blake's own creation. These books propound a revolutionary new social, intellectual, and ethical order. Blake published almost all of his works himself, by an original process in which the poems were etched by hand, along with illustrations and decorative images, onto copper plates. These plates were inked to make prints, and the prints were then colored with paint. This expensive and labor-intensive production method resulted in a quite limited circulation of Blake's poetry during his life. It has also posed a special set of challenges to scholars of Blake's work, which has interested both literary critics and art historians. Most students of Blake find it necessary to consider his graphic art and his writing together. Certainly he himself thought of them as inseparable. During his own lifetime, Blake was a pronounced failure, and he harbored a good deal of resentment and anxiety about the public's apathy toward his work and about the financial straits in which he so regularly found himself. When his self-curated exhibition of his works met with financial failure in 1809, Blake sank into depression and withdrew into obscurity. He remained alienated for the rest of his life. His contemporaries saw him as something of an eccentric, as indeed he was. Suspended between the neoclassicism of the 18th century and the early phases of Romanticism, Blake belongs to no single poetic school or age. Only in the 20th century did wide audiences begin to acknowledge his profound originality and genius. Analysis. Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience, 1794, juxtapose the innocent, pastoral world of childhood against an adult world of corruption and repression. While such poems as The Lamb represent a meek virtue, poems like The Tiger exhibit opposing, darker forces. Thus the collection as a whole explores the value and limitations of two different perspectives on the world. Many of the poems fall into pairs, so that the same situation or problem is seen through the lens of innocence first and then experience. Blake does not identify himself wholly with either view. Most of the poems are dramatic, that is, in the voice of a speaker rather than the poet himself. Blake stands outside innocence and experience. in a distanced position from which he hopes to be able to recognize and correct the fallacies of both. In particular, he pits himself against despotic authority, restrictive morality, sexual repression, and institutionalized religion. His great insight is into the way these separate modes of control work together to squelch what is most holy in human beings. The Songs of Innocence dramatize the naive hopes and fears that inform the lives of children and trace their transformation as the child grows into adulthood. Some of the poems are written from the perspective of children, while others are about children as seen from an adult perspective. Many of the poems draw attention to the positive aspects of natural human understanding prior to the corruption and distortion of experience. Others take a more critical stance toward innocent purity. For example, while Blake draws touching portraits of the emotional power of rudimentary Christian values, he also exposes, over the heads, as it were, of the innocent, Christianity's capacity for promoting injustice and cruelty. The Songs of Experience work via parallels and contrasts to lament the ways in which the harsh experiences of adult life destroy what is good in innocence, while also articulating the weaknesses of the innocent perspective. The tiger, for example, attempts to account for real, negative forces in the universe, which innocence fails to confront. These latter poems treat sexual morality in terms of the repressive effects of jealousy, shame, and secrecy, all of which corrupt the ingenuousness of innocent love. With regard to religion, they are less concerned with the character of individual faith than with the institution of the Church, its role in politics, and its effects on society and the individual mind. Experience thus adds a layer to innocence that darkens its hopeful vision while compensating for some of its blindness. The style of the Songs of Innocence and Experience is simple and direct, but the language and the rhythms are painstakingly crafted, and the ideas they explore are often deceptively complex. Many of the poems are narrative in style, others, like The Sick Rose and The Divine Image, make their arguments through symbolism or by means of abstract concepts. Some of Blake's favorite rhetorical techniques are personification and the reworking of biblical symbolism and language. Blake frequently employs the familiar meters of ballads, nursery rhymes, and hymns, applying them to his own, often unorthodox conceptions. This combination of the traditional with the unfamiliar is consonant with Blake's perpetual interest in reconsidering and reframing the assumptions of human thought and social behavior. An important feature to note reading any poem within Songs of Innocence and Experience is that it allows the marginalized figures of society a voice in which their story can be told. Innocence would seem to be the more controlled, ignorant perception of the truth, whereas Experience breaks down Songs of Innocence and shows the real horror of the situation. Blake does this brilliantly by the use of contrast, and it is when the sister poem in Songs of Experience is read and that voice of the truth comes through, it forces you not to ignore it, where the two books come together and promptly force the reader to see the truth and not revert back to ignorance. In terms of imagery, the idea of innocence is strong in reference to children, which then comes back to the point of the marginalized figures. As children were a strong labor force within factories working under dangerous conditions and treated as slaves in poverty, Blake also uses natural images such as flowers in his poetry, which in the grand scheme of things represents the children. The bright, young and fragile beings who are being smothered in the cold, dark smoke of London town. This all brings into terms the idea of death. Songs of Innocence almost grounds the reader into a state of security. Secure in the sense that we are living in a model society that is prospering and above all others. Yet, Songs of Experience destroys that foundation and pleads for us to do something about it. a scar which demands healing. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to my channel.